You know, at Christmas time, we all have expectations at Christmas. When we think of Christmas, we get these, and for many people, we get these fond thoughts of, oh, we're going to, the chestnuts roasting on an open fire. Whenever I hear that song, actually, I think of the Folgers commercial, when that guy came home and how many remember that back in the 80s? The guy had that turtleneck sweater. His son came home to see mom. And okay, forget about it. Has anyone done chestnuts on an open fire at Christmas? Nobody's ever done that. I mean, we sing about things we've never done, but you have. Okay, thanks. You're the only one in the room. But you think about that stuff, and I mean, you think about sitting around drinking eggnog around the Christmas tree, and everybody's festive, and the food, and the Christmas gifts, and everything's just great. And the reality is, that's not reality. In fact, we go into Christmas with this perception of this just, Christmas parties and all of this stuff. Snow as people are walking along the sidewalks, the cobblestone, the sidewalk. We don't even have cobblestone sidewalks anymore. But we get in Christmas movies we've seen 1,000 times, and we get this feeling of Christmas. But in reality, by the time it's done, everybody's ready to say, "C'est la vie." Right? It's like, I'm ready for Christmas to be done. Or take down the tree the very next day. I mean, okay, it's over. The Christmas music, oh, please let the Christmas music stop. How many say, after about 3 weeks of Christmas music, you're ready to pack away the albums, right? Because the reality of what Christmas is about isn't always what was expected or is expected. And the reality is even before Jesus came, leading up to the birth of Christ, there was this expectation of the Messiah, that he was going to be from this family that was a majestic family, like a very highly esteemed family. And the Messiah was going to come almost as an adult, not as a kid. And when he came, it was going to be in these courts of angels, and there was going to be this just great coming of the Messiah, and he was going to establish his kingdom. And he came not at all as people expected. In fact, no one expected him to come as a baby in a manger to a couple no one had ever heard of before. No one expected for him to be this little boy that pooped his pants. No one expected for him to be almost human. And even today, when we look at Christ, we don't even at times look at him as being human. Well, that's what Jesus did. I couldn't do that. We almost put him in this place that he wasn't. How many know Jesus was a man? He had to eat to survive. He had to wear clothing just like the rest of us, and he had to wash his clothes. They weren't like divinely washed in his effervescent glow. He was very real. And this morning I'm going to take a turn. Last year I talked on a lot of the messages I shared were much more Christmassy in the sense of it just had that Christmas ebb to it. But this year I'm really going to talk about some of those things around Christmas that we don't really always talk about and don't necessarily make us feel Christmassy, but are as much a part of Christmas and as important for Christmas as any other time. In the Gospels, they're the first 4 books of the New Testament. You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay? Of the Gospels, 2 of them don't even talk about the birth of Christ. The 2 that do are Matthew and Luke. And Luke talks first really about John the Baptist, begins with John the Baptist, and then goes into the birth of Christ. Matthew begins talking about Jesus, but not the Christmas story. Now, I guarantee you the text we're going to look at this morning, you've never had mentioned or shared on Christmas Day, because every kid wants the Christmas story to be a little shorter, right? I grew up in our house, before we ever opened gifts, we had to read the Christmas story. And my grandfather, who was a former pastor, took a long time reading it. Anyone had a grandpa like that? And I think he did that because he wanted to preach to all of his grandkids. And the gifts weren't even that good. I mean, but we were anytime you get gifts. How many love gifts? Just raise your hand. You are liars. Some of you are lying through you. How many love gifts? You love to get a gift, right? And as a kid, you want to get a gift. You don't want to open the gift. You've been sneaking, trying to figure it out for a week. Now you want to see if it's actually what it is, right? And you want to play with it. And he would go on and on. Well, this never came up, and surprisingly never came up in my grandfather's Christmas stories. And that was the lineage of Jesus. I mean, I thought about, I read this lineage part, putting Christmas music behind it, but I didn't want to bore you with that. But what we're going to talk about is the lineage of Jesus and how this lineage has to do with Christmas, okay? So how many enjoy just going through Deuteronomy's, Leviticus, lineages? Anyone just love doing that? Well, we're going to do that this morning. We're going to go to the first verse in Matthew chapter 1. It says, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David. Why it was so important that this genealogy be spoken of is because Matthew wanted to show everyone that Jesus was the Messiah. And in order to do that, he had to show that Jesus was from the lineage of David, King David. He had to show that Jesus came from David. Now, this is especially interesting because in ancient days, if you're a history buff, you'll know this, there were historians. Well, who paid historians? Who are the people that paid the historians? The people making the history. So a king or an emperor or some leader or general would pay an historian to record their history. Now, how many have ever told your history to someone and you just naturally forget all of the low points of your life? Right? When you tell people about your success, like your financial happenings in life, you tend to tell them about all of the successes where you made lots of money, but you'd never tell them where you lost all of that money, right? And these generals were no different than you and I. They would have these historians record the battles where they won, great feats of battle, but they would kind of downplay the battles that they lost. And it would be other historians that would record the successes of those generals. And that's just how it was in history. And so during this time, if somebody was taking the history of a person, they would tend to be more flattering in that history. They would tend to talk about how great things were. And so here's Matthew recording the history. He says, the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac, the father of Jacob. Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers. Now, are there any women mentioned in that? No, because you wouldn't mention a woman in a genealogy, and this is why. There are a couple of reasons. One, it was a male-dominated society. All you ladies go, I knew we didn't like them very much, right? It was a male-dominated society. And here's a little-known biological fact. You got a history lesson, now you get a biological fact. Life is actually sent to the child by the father, not by the mother. So when women say, I brought you into this world, you brought him into the world, but the father gave that child life. Life came through the sperm to the egg. Okay? That's why they carry the father's name, is because of that actual biological fact. How many knew that? Right? Okay, 2 of you in here. So there, if you didn't learn anything else this morning, you learned that fact, okay? So the father, it mentions just men, but look at this next verse. If you're a historian only pointing out the pluses of who you are and kind of building up the fact that you're the Messiah, why would he do this? Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Next week I'm talking about Tamar, and there are verses in the story of Tamar that I won't even read in church. That's how bad she was. That's how bad her story was. And yet Matthew points out Tamar as one of the being in the genealogy of Jesus. Now, if you're trying to make somebody look good, you don't put Tamar in there. You try to hide Tamar. How many have relatives? You say, yeah, I was with my relatives, and you accidentally forget that relative. Right? Anyone here? None of you. We go to the holidays, and you leave holiday going, how am I related to those people? Right? Now it goes on. It goes on. To the next verse, it says, Ram, the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab, the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon, the father of Salmon, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. I mean, why are you even putting women in the genealogy? But when you do, you pick out Tamar and Rahab. Rahab wasn't even a Jew. And not only that, Rahab's reputation was she was Rahab even you know that. And you're going to put that? Everybody knew who Rahab was. And so now Matthew is saying that you're related to Rahab. I mean, it's crazy. Go to the next verse. Again, he doesn't have Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Now, Ruth was out of the four of these ladies I'm going to mention. Ruth is probably the best one, but Ruth, she was from Moab. She wasn't even Jewish. And I know when you hear Moab, you think of the book of Amos. But that's who Ruth was. She was from Moab. Okay, goes on. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. He doesn't even say her name. He's like, oh, by the way, he has a woman that cheated with David, and that's his great-grandparent. I mean, how many know who he's talking about? Bathsheba, right? So he's looking, of all the women to point out, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, really, as he says, the woman who had been married to Uriah's wife. I mean, like there's no one else they could have mentioned, like Sarah, Rebecca, she's a good one. I mean, Deborah. I mean, there were women who are great women. Why doesn't he mention those women? Why does he pick out these women of all women? Why would he pick out these women? It doesn't support the case of Jesus being the Messiah. I mean, it's not pointing to him being the Messiah. It kind of says, you mean you got mothers that aren't even Jewish? You're not even a purebred Jesus? There's a point, and this is the point in the whole story. Jesus not only came for sinners, Jesus came from sinners. He didn't come for them, but he came from it. And this is especially important for Matthew. Because Matthew was just like each of these women. And we're going to talk about these women around Christmas and talk about really what this is all about. The point of Christmas is not all the Christmas music. The point of Christmas is not about all the food we're going to eat and the presents we're going to open. Even at this point, Matthew had walked with Jesus for 3 years. Matthew had experienced the many miracles of Jesus. He had seen how he fed 5,000 people. He had heard the message Jesus preached. Matthew knew he was a Messiah, not because of his genealogy, but because of who Jesus was. And then he looks at his genealogy, knowing he's already the Messiah. He already knows that. It's already been established. He looks at the genealogy and says, that is the point. He came for the sinners, not for those who say they're righteous. Now let's take a look at Matthew's life. Let's take a look at Matthew's life in chapter 9, verse 2. When Jesus saw their faith, he said, now let me set this up a little bit. What happened was Jesus came off the Sea of Galilee, came into Capernaum. And he's coming into the port of Capernaum, and they get off the boat, and people see that Jesus is coming, and they immediately bring the sick because they know about this Jesus. And there are religious leaders all around Jesus, and they're standing there watching, and these people bring this paralytic man, and they set him down before Jesus, and look at what Jesus does in this verse. He says, when Jesus saw their faith, for this man to be healed. That's why they were bringing the man to be before Jesus. They're bringing him to be healed. He said to the paralytic, "Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven." Well, that's great, but that's not why he was there. He wasn't there for his sins to be forgiven. He was there because he wanted to walk. The people, here's the thing, people weren't chasing after Jesus for their sins to be forgiven. They were chasing after Jesus because they wanted miracles. There are a lot of Christians that are chasing after Jesus for miracles. They don't care if you forgive my sins or not. There are a lot of Christians that have no joy in their relationship with Jesus Christ because Christ is nothing more than a genie to them. And they rub the bottle and they say, "What wishes do you want?" And you say, "Give me a miracle." And Jesus gives this man what he needs most, which is the forgiveness of his sins. And it creates this huge uprising because the religious leaders that are around says, "By what authority can you forgive sins?" Jesus has been saying this whole time, "I have authority to forgive sins." And they're nitpicking everything Jesus does. Now, this is something that I want to address because it's something that I noticed even happening in my own life. I was sitting there and this last week, and I was noticing something that it's almost like it's contagious. You know, there's this cold going around. How many know somebody who's this cold that's going around? Lasts like 2 weeks, right? And they hack every night. My wife caught it, and I got no sleep. All right? How many know what I'm talking? Don't do that. Oh, it's the reality. I didn't get any sleep because she's coughing the whole night. And she didn't get any sleep either, so we both are crabby. And here's the thing. There's this thing, this almost nitpickiness that is really starting to almost permeate through our society. And we're seeing it more and more and more because it's very contagious. And the only way I can explain is like we are in a society where we nitpick everything. Now, this is a very serious thing. I think, how many know we're in a spiritual battle, right? And it's very real. There's a very real spiritual battle, and the battlefield's played out most of the time in our mind. There is a battlefield in our mind, and this battlefield where literally we get nitpicked so much at work or in our marriage or with our friends. There's a nitpicking that goes on, and it's nitpick, that eventually we begin to nitpick. Now, in case this goes right over our head, we'll put up your catcher glove. Okay? Because I'm telling you, I found myself nitpicking is literally, right? We watch the news, we nitpick our politicians. We nitpick our coaches of the teams we like if they're not winning. And even when they're winning, we nitpick the players on the team that aren't helping us win by more. We nitpick our spouses for everything they're not doing to meet our every waking need. We nitpick our pastor for not preaching it exactly the way we want it preached or doing exactly the things we want to do. We nitpick our friends for not showing up when we thought they should show up when they had no idea that they were supposed to show up. We nitpick our neighbors because they put too many Christmas lights on their yard or not enough Christmas lights on their yard. We nitpick the people we drive with on the highway because they swerved in front of me without using their blinker, or they didn't stop long enough at the stop sign, or they don't drive quite fast enough, or they're driving way too fast. We nitpick the teachers that we have. We nitpick the boss we have or the employees we work with. because they're not quite adding up, and I'm the one doing all the work, and they never do anything. And we nitpick, and we sit, and we feed, and we become a nitpicky people. The waitress didn't just do the food just right, or didn't get it to it, so we nitpick. How many are in here saying, amen, you got me? Okay, I get this. And what happens is we're going to go through, and literally this, it's almost like a spirit, it is just permeated, and at some point we have to stop because we will nitpick each other to death. And what I've noticed is, this is one way I can get closer to you. All right. What I've noticed is, we used to have an aquarium when I was in college. It was a big 50-gallon tank. And there were angels. We had angels. You know, how many know what I'm talking about, those angels? And we had about 50 fish in this tank. And there were aggressive fish. And you know, when you're in college and you're a guy, I mean, some fish you want for beauty, but you really have fish because you want to see UFC among fish. How many know what I'm talking about, right? Like, you want to see these fish going after each other, man. And that's it. Well, I was in college, so I was young. Some of you are looking at me like, yeah, right. We put sharks in the aquarium that would go after the angelfish. And so they would nip at it and nip at it and nip at it, and eventually until their fin was completely gone. Okay, now I'm being vulnerable here. You're all thinking I'm this ruthless guy. I get it. It was fun at the time, but at the cost of a fish. But the what happens is the more you get nitpicked, the easier it is to start nitpicking everyone else in your life, where you nitpick your spouse, and pretty soon all of your relationships start to die. And our legacy becomes that which we've torn down and not what we've built up. What in your life can you look at right now and say, this is something that I am building up, not tearing down? How did we get to this whole thing on nitpicking anyway? Because the religious leaders would look at God in a bod, Jesus, and act like they knew better than Christ. They nitpicked Christ every waking moment. They were around Christ all the time, nitpicking. Everything Christ did wasn't right. Christ couldn't be the Messiah because. And they nitpicked to a point they didn't even recognize the greatest gift ever given to man was right in front of them. That the answer to all of their hurts, all of their frustrations, all of their problems was there the whole time. But they were too busy nitpicking it that they didn't even know. And listen, God's answer to some of your prayers, you haven't noticed it because you're nitpicking it. It's true. Once you stop nitpicking, because it's easy to nitpick. It's a lot more work to build. It's easy to tear something down. It's a lot more difficult to build it up. And that's what Christ has called us to do, to be reconcilers, to build up. Not to tear down, but to build up. That's the difference. And here's Jesus. Jesus came to build up, and the Pharisees, the religious leaders, were tearing down. Now, how do I know whether I'm a disciple of Christ or a religious leader? Okay? Now, there's some variance in this, in the sense that the disciples of Christ build, religious leaders tear down. If I'm there tearing down everybody and everything and nothing is good enough, then you have to stop and recognize, man, do I got this almost the same illness that the religious leaders had? Now, we just talked about 4 women that were sinners in the lineage of Christ. And Matthew lists the worst women. If you're going to list women, like I said, Sarah would have been a great one. But Tamar, Rahab, the wife of Uriah? Why them? Why listen? It's because Matthew could relate. Matthew was in Capernaum the day that this miracle took place. And look what happens. Matthew comes up, and he says to this man, Jesus comes up probably to pay taxes. Matthew was a tax collector. Matthew is sitting at a table, I'm sure maybe something like this, or sitting at a table, and there's a table there, and Matthew is the tax collector, and he's sitting there, and Jesus and the disciples come up, I'm sure, to probably pay taxes, because if they ported in Capernaum, you had to pay a tax for porting. Now, what Rome did at this period of time is Rome would sell the right to collect taxes. You would buy the right to collect taxes for 5 years, and they would sell the right to do that. Now, tax collectors were not even grouped in the group of sinners. In fact, they were a group unto themselves worse than sinners. People saw tax collectors as being worse than sinners themselves. You really want to insult somebody? Just say, you tax collector. Right? That would have been like an insult of insults, because what they did was, what the tax collectors would do from Rome is they were not liked. I mean, they were the people, you egged their house. You forked their yard. You did all of that stuff to them, right? That was the stuff that you just didn't like them. So they would hire Jewish people. They would hire Jewish people to actually collect taxes. And those people, those Jews that would collect taxes, were considered to be the worst of the worst scum of the earth. Right? Now, when I was in Israel, I was there one time a number of years ago, and I'm sitting on the corner with the guy I was with. We're sitting there, and this guy dressed up in a very Orthodox Jew sitting right next to me, and he kept doing this to me. And I looked at him, I'm like, man, the guy's got a tick or something. I mean, an issue. And the guy next to me said, no, he's spitting at you. I said, spitting at me? Why would he spit at me? I'm just standing, because he said, you're unclean. You're unclean, so he's spitting at you. I had to fight the temptation to spit back. Now, he's just spitting air. I was going to get a good loogie and just go. That's American style spitting. But what he was saying is, you're unclean. Why are you here? Okay? Now you can just imagine the disciples, Jesus, they're coming up to pay their taxes, and you can imagine Peter sitting there just thinking, what am I going to tell this guy sitting at the tax collecting table? What am I going to tell them? How am I going to just set them straight? Because this is the worst of the worst, and we're here doing good. We're here doing good. And they go up there, and I'm sure Judas was there, because Judas was one that carried the money bags, and I'm sure he's getting up to pay. And Jesus says to this man, and they're just waiting, what is Jesus going to tell this worst of sinners? I mean, like, he is evil. He's Lucifer embodied in tax collector. That's how much they hate this guy. And I'm sure they're just waiting to hear the one-liner Jesus is going to send across their bow. And Jesus says, hi, Matthew. Why don't you come follow me? And you could just see Peter thinking, like, what? Jesus, what are you thinking? I mean, this guy will not be good for our brand. It just will not work. You need a Jesus? I'm telling you, this is not a guy we want to hang out with. He is the Jesus. This is can you just see Peter just like, and Matthew says, sure, and he gets up from his table and he says, Jesus, where would you like me to follow you to? He says, I was thinking we'd kind of go to your house. And Matthew's got to be like, what are you crazy? What will people think? I mean, we already got these religious leaders all around us. They're already nitpicking. They're already looking for some way to deny that you're the Messiah. Well, Jesus, we can't go to a tax collector's house. What are you, nuts? Jesus, this is a little crazy here. I mean, you've done a lot of crazy things, and I've been there with you. I've supported you, but this is a little over the line. Go to a party at a tax collector's house. Jesus, do you know what you're doing? And they go to the tax collector. They go to Matthew's house. Now, for Matthew, this is crazy, because no religious leader, Jesus was known as a rabbi. No religious leader would ever step foot. They would never get caught talking to a tax collector, because they would then be considered unclean, but they would certainly not go into their house because it would take many, many days to go through the ceremonial cleansing that would have to take place in order to do that. And yet here is Jesus. He walks into this man's home. He says, invite all of your friends over. They all come over, and he sits with them. And all of the Pharisees, the religious leaders, are standing on the outside, and they're going, they're like, this man is blasphemous. This guy, he claims that righteousness is important, yet he does these type of things. Now, before you get too critical of the religious leaders, I want you to stop for a moment and just think about, how do you determine whether you're righteous or not? Because many Christians, for many number of years, determine their righteousness based on behavior and not based on the price Jesus paid for you. That I am righteous today because I act righteously. When in reality, that makes not even a little bit of sense. Righteousness is right standing with God. It has nothing to do with behavior. It's a matter of God being in right standing with you. Now, what does all this have to do with Christmas? This is the point. Matthew knew this was the Messiah. Matthew knew this was God's answer to all of the things in the world that were broken. Matthew knew that Jesus was the one God was sending to fulfill the law. And he was trying to show every one of those religious leaders, because I'm sure when they were outside Matthew's house, even as Matthew's right, I'm sure the religious leaders, they said, come out here, come out here, come out here. How is it that you follow a man that goes into a tax collector's house? And they were sitting there, they were upset, they were nitpicking, they were angry, because that's not what a religious person's supposed to do. Jesus was calling into question everything they had believed before. And they were struggling to believe it to be true. And Jesus hears them talking, and he says this in this verse. He says, and Jesus went on from there and saw a man named Matthew. Go to the next verse. On hearing this, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Now look at the next verse. But go and learn what this means. Okay? He's telling them, I want you to learn what this means. Because you think you know everything. You think just because, and here's Jesus bringing the truth. He says, because you don't agree with me, you think you're right, when in reality they weren't right at all. He says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but what? Which would have been maybe insulting to Matthew and his friends. But you know what's interesting, what I found out about sinners? They may get a little offended, but in the end, they know that they're sinners. But there's something that gets missed in this, which it's probably what was really being said, and Jesus was trying to get this point across, and people were missing it. He says, for I have not come to call the righteous. And at that time, the people who were nitpicking saw themselves as being righteous. That's the point. The reality was, at that time, there was nobody who was righteous. There was nobody who was righteous. Not one person that lived on the planet was righteous. What he was saying is, I'm coming for those who see themselves for what they really are, sinners in need of a Savior. See, the whole idea of Jesus coming to earth is not a big deal to you if you think you're righteous on your own and you've done everything you need to do and your behavior is great and everything is wonderful. You don't need Jesus. You just need him to do miracles. I just need him to do the supernatural stuff when I need a supernatural event to take place in my life. But there's really no joy with the reality, because I'm okay. I grew up in the church, or maybe I've never done anything. I didn't kill anybody. I didn't steal anything. I didn't do anything bad. I'm a good person. I am righteous. Jesus didn't come for those who think they're righteous. He came for those who knew they were sinners and needed righteousness through Jesus Christ. That's the point of Christmas. Jesus came for people who knew who they really were. I want to ask you to bow your head.